Imagine that you could step back in time when rainforests covered much of the landscape and tigers roamed the island of Singapore.
Well, a lineup of events to mark the Bicentennial Commemoration will soon make that a reality. I found out why two men from the pages of natural history will soon be immortalised to mark 200 years of Singapore's biodiversity. The island of Singapore in the early 19th century. An impenetrable matrix of tropical rainforest. Dark, humid and chaotic. The only life apparent, what was heard. It was a time when tigers roamed.
Singapore today is very different from Singapore of the 1800s. We had a lot more interesting plants and animals here. You tell young people these days, we were a man-eating capital of the world. They won't believe you. You can't imagine there's a wild tiger running around Bukit Timah, picking off people along the streets of the villages. But it happened.
The arrival of British colonialism brought with it the clearing of large swathes of land for farming. Before that, Singapore's lush jungles teemed with life and diversity. Many specimens of this rich flora and fauna were collected and preserved by early naturalists. But it was the work of one of them that is the most remarkable. Alfred Russel Wallace was one of the greatest field biologists of the 19th century. He was a pioneer of biogeography. Many Singaporeans would be hard-pressed to tell you exactly who Wallace was in history and just what his relationship with Singapore's biodiversity was all about.
Alfred Wallace spent many of his years in this part of the world, so he used Singapore as a jumping off point to all his exploits in the region, so Malaysia, Indonesia, right? And he traveled extensively to look for all sorts of strange animals, particularly birds and mammals, and he collected huge numbers of these. And of course he brought it to experts in Europe, America, who studied all his material.
The Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum at NUS is home to more than 500,000 catalogued specimens. From animals to fossils, it's a collection that dates back to 1849. One of its most precious specimens, an Asian brown flycatcher, collected by Wallace himself. Now that has been joined by a new valuable addition from the Wallace collection. A rare bird of paradise, acquired by the museum via a private collection. It took Wallace 8 years to explore the jungles, rivers and mountains of Southeast Asia. He was helped by a 100-strong team. It included guides, bird shooters and skinners. Between 1854 and 1862, Wallace and his team collected over 120,000 natural history specimens. His expedition resulting in one of science history's classic tales, the Malay Archipelago, which documents in great detail Singapore's early biodiversity. And Wallace's findings in Southeast Asia confirmed another pivotal theory.
This is a man with Darwin came up with the theory of modern evolution. That's one of the core theorems of the modern day in science that hold so many disciplines together. And this is a man who came up with those ideas, who used Singapore as a base. So we are part of this scientific history as well. It is something Singapore and Southeast Asia has much to be proud of.
One of Wallace's trusted assistants was Ali, a Malay teenager from Sarawak, Borneo. At first a cook and servant, he would eventually become Wallace's chief assistant or head man. Wallace wrote extensively about Ali in his autobiography.
Ali accompanied me through all my travels, sometimes alone, but more frequently with several others. And he was then very useful in teaching them their duties, as he soon became well acquainted with my wants and habits.
Obviously he thought very much of this young man, okay? And if you read his books, Ali is weaved into the fabric of the natural history of this region, okay? Ali helped Wallace a great deal. Wallace acknowledged it in his books, in writing, even though he didn't have to, okay? And that's important. It shows the humility and the man that Wallace is. It shows that it's not a single man's effort. Okay? It also showed there was local contribution to all these discoveries.
The part both Wallace and Ali played in Singapore's natural history is now being immortalised in bronze. Under the guidance of Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts tutor, artist Lim Soo-Nyi, 3 students were selected to work on a project that will pay homage to these 2 historic figures. A task which caught them a little unawares.
So when he started, we had no idea who he was. And we were like, is he actually such a big person?
We don't really learn much about our own history in Singapore. They mostly focus on people like Raffles. So I feel like it's our duty to put ourselves out there and research more into our own history to know ourselves better as a society.
When people go to the museum and they see this work and they try to understand who this person is, or if they go back home and research about him, it's a way of passing on history to the future generations.
These students say the controversial design for the statue, with Ali bearing a gun poised to hunt a bird, represents the symbiotic role between master and student, and hope it will put into focus our own efforts at conservation today.
Did Wallace have a sense of conservation? Yes, he did, but not in the same way we see conservation today, because he didn't see the nightmares that we are facing today. Climate change, mass destruction of habitats, mass overconsumption. He set the stage for the knowledge. Today, when we talk about environmental challenges and conservation, we look back and say, all right, what do we want? Okay? Why do we lament? We lament because we knew what was here. You cannot conserve what you don't know, and you cannot chart the way ahead. You never knew what you had.
Now that is a sentiment that Wallace himself would have shared. Taking note of how much virgin rainforest was being cleared in Bukit Timah, he predicted that countless tribes of interesting wildlife and insects would soon become extinct if the practice continued. To protect it, Singapore's biodiversity must be surveyed quickly, he urged, lest it be lost forever. And for more on the commemorative bicentennial plans that will put Singapore's natural history heritage front and centre, we're joined in the studio by the head of the NUS Lee Kong Chian School Natural History Museum, Professor Peter Ng. Prof. Ng, welcome.
My pleasure to be here.
So, Prof, why is natural history so important to the fabric of Singapore's heritage? Put that into context for us.
Well, I mean, natural history is part of the heritage of Singapore. I mean, we talk about cultural heritage, building heritage and so on. I mean, at the end of the day, heritage is about remembering what things were, where you came from, the experiences you had when you were young or growing up, and all these is weaved into our memories, into what life is and life will be. We transmit these messages to the young ones, the younger generation, so they remember what things were. At the end of the day, I think a country, a nation without memories is a very scary thing. Right? So memories are important. And natural heritage is part of the whole fabric of that.
And there are many lessons we can learn from Wallace. One of the ones I wanted to get your thoughts on, because you mentioned it as well during that story just then, was about how species evolve in order to adapt in their environments, and how he perhaps isn't as remembered as Charles Darwin with that regard. What do you put that down to?
Well, I mean, both men authored this landmark paper on the theory of evolution, which is still one of the most important theories we use today for science. Darwin is, of course, much more famous, right? Wallace, less well known, but for all scholars in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia and East Asia, we identify ourselves much more with Wallace primarily because he was here, right? And unlike Darwin, there's a big difference, right? Wallace was actually in the jungles, in the field, and he suffered a great deal more for his science than Darwin did. Right? So he was much more of a working man. He actually collected specimens, not just for science, but to make a living. Right? He caught no end of strange diseases, from malaria to yellow fever. So he actually was working on the ground with the rest of the locals at the time. So in that sense, I think most scientists here identify with him. And his writings are very different in the sense that you compare his writings to Darwin. Darwin is, of course, more technical, more scientific. Wallace, in between all his scientific tales, you sense a lot more emotion and intensity because it's different. He was at the point for most of these things when he found them. So, much more human. I'm biased.
Yeah, I think he contracted malaria and yellow fever and all kinds of illnesses from the forest. So he was very much a working biologist, and that's something that you still do, something that biologists still do today.
I think these days, I mean, we don't like to be armchair scientists, armchair naturalists. I mean, we ourselves and our students, we encourage them to go to the field, to see the animals, to study the animals in situ, right? So it has moved a lot from just sitting in the lab. Natural history, the fun part of it is being out there, right? And that's what Wallace did 150 years ago.
And well, tell us more about this this Asian brown flycatcher then, that sort of also got a bit of a brief mention.
Well,
why is
that flycatcher actually was part of the Wallace collection. It's been with the museum for a long time, right? And of course, we're very proud of it. It's a scruffy looking bird, but it's steep in history, right? And we were lucky because several years ago, in fact, just 2 years ago, a friend of mine in London said, Peter, you know, this is a private collector who's getting rid of his collections. There's a Wallace bird of paradise there, you know. Would you like to have it? Right? And he was offering it to us before he went on auction, so we could get a good price for it. Yeah. So didn't take very long to decide. I mean, it's a valuable bird. It's one of these classic, iconic animals that Wallace is identified with because it is named after Wallace, right? So
the Wallace flycatcher.
And when will it be available for the public to see?
The Wallace Standard Wing, that's the name of the bird of paradise that we have right now. So we prepared it, and it'll be launched at the same time as the statue. So as part of the bicentennial, we are doing a piece of the statue, of course, as you've seen in the clip. Nice clip, okay? And we are also going to exhibit both of Wallace's birds at the same time in the museum, so people can have a look at what these animals are, right?
So, Prof, let's talk a little bit about that statue. You know, we're in 2019, and we're not seeing that many statues being made in Singapore anymore. Here we have a brand new one, cast in bronze.
Yes.
And it's not just one character, it's the two men. It's Ali and it's Wallace together. Now, Ali is poised to hunt a bird in this. So some might see that as a little bit controversial, taking into account the fact he's hunting, but collectors did hunt. That's what they did. How do you reconcile that with today's idea of conservation?
Okay, the time is different. Wallace's time, you're talking about 150, 160 years ago, when there was much more forest, and we knew far less about the animals and the birds there, right? Even today, very often, in order to understand and study the animals, you have to collect them. You have to put them in front of you, right? And invariably, well, you have to do some not so nice things to them. This statue is interesting, primarily because it's the first time we're actually featuring both the master and the disciple together, all right? Wallace, together with his trusted number 2, Ali, all right? There was a lot of discussion. Should we pretend that Ali was just looking at the bird and not doing anything? No, the reality was, in that time, that's what they did as part of their science, as part of their living, right? I don't like to hide from reality. They did kill animals. That's the unpleasant truth. The good thing is this. All the animals that were hunted, shot, killed in that era, they form the basis for the knowledge we have today. What species they are, where they are found, what they are doing. With that, it sets the stage of what we have to do today. Today, if you tell me you're going to shoot a bird of paradise, you know, that's the wrong thing to do. 100 years ago, if you didn't even know what the bird was, well, I needed it on hand to identify it. So the context is correct. And this statue is, it's very interesting, mainly also because, not just because the two men are both there, but because it's actually a statue of love constructed by both the scientists, which are interested in Wallace, and a bunch of art folks, okay, Mr. Lim and his 3 students who are very passionate about it. The idea is the merging of science and art together to tell a historical point in time. Wallace belongs to the region, and Singapore is an important point where he started off his work, right? And to have such a statue with both Wallace and Ali is wonderful. It's perfect for the bicentennial.
Well, some would say science and art are 2 sides of the same coin, really.
I agree. They are the 2 sides of the same coin.
All right, well, thanks so much for coming in and speaking with us this evening. Professor Peter Ng,
my pleasure.
CEO of the NUS Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum.